back into here. So, what we're going to be doing today is, I hope, we'll see, but I hope that we'll be finishing this last chapter that's going to be included in our up and coming exam. So we have a lecture exam this Saturday coming up, and so this is our last chapter included in it. So we have what? Digestive system, is that right? And urinary system. Those are two systems that are included in the exam coming up. And then this fluid and pH and electrolyte chapter, where it's kind of a synthesis chapter, bringing it together. So we'll work on finishing this up today, and then my hope is that all of Wednesday would just be review, right? So going through exam objectives, and again, with the exam objectives, I did go through and I cleaned them up a bit, and so hopefully that has been, bless you, a little bit better in terms of, I know sometimes there's like redundancies and stuff like that, or things that are like, this seems to overlap with that other one. So hopefully I've gotten rid of those, which should facilitate you going through them and then getting your solid answers and then practicing with those this week to make that short answer section one of the easiest sections of the exam. Okay, so we will review on Wednesday. So last we left off, we had gone big picture in terms of talking about the fluid aspect of the body, how we have distributions of fluids in our body in different places, as well as the amount of fluids in our body changes at different stages of our life, whether we're a baby or a toddler or middle age or even elderly on some level, right? Our body composition changes, our body metabolism changes, etc. And when we were talking about this, we were saying that with these fluids, the main place where these fluids are going to be contained are actually in the cells of our body, which kind of makes sense, right? Our whole body is made up of cells, trillions of different types of cells, right, that we've been learning about through time, and inside of all of them is intracellular fluid. So that inside of that plasma membrane, there's a lot of fluid in there, and since cells make up most of us, that intracellular fluid is the main place where we have fluids in the body. But then we have a bunch of other places, so 2/3 of our fluids are there. We have a bunch of extracellular fluid that is exterior to the cells, like the interstitial fluid, like the plasma and stuff like that, where these are going to be places where we're going to be exchanging fluids with and solutes and things like that all the time. And we learned that in the cardiovascular system, right? So for instance, we talked about in those capillaries, we have, for instance, internal respiration with gases going from the plasma into the interstitial fluid, into the cells, and back. The same thing with nutrients and waste products and fluids and things like that, okay? So, again, now what we're going to be focusing on is, okay, so let's talk about water itself. How does the body regulate water, just by itself, water levels in the body? Then we'll move on to some of the most important electrolytes, our salts, if you will, our ions that we find in the body. And we'll talk about how some of the most important ones are controlled or regulated. And then we'll wrap up with how we control pH in the body. And you'll find, I think, as you continue in your healthcare pathways, that even though this isn't a system of the body that we're going through, it's definitely key concepts and content to understand, because your future patients are going to have some imbalances potentially in all of these things, right? They're only going to be coming to you when there is something wrong, when they are out of whack, when they're having symptoms of some sort of imbalance. And oftentimes it may have to do with dehydration, particularly in the desert, or if they're stressed or something like that. If you're sick, if you are sick with something, then that affects what you're doing. Sometimes it affects how you're breathing, how you're eating and drinking, right? If you're not eating and drinking enough because you're not feeling well, oh, okay, now other things are going to get out of whack as well, right? So electrolyte levels might be off, pH might be off, and those imbalances can affect a lot of the systems of the body. We have systems of the body that are responsible for keeping them in check, and if they're not kept in check, then other systems of the body, because everything's connected, can be affected, okay? Okay, so we're talking about water to begin with. And with water, we want to look at, again, balances. Like, what influences our balance? And for most of these, it is going to come down to input and output. So just like your balance of your checking account or something like that, that also comes into this balance between input and output. So if you are, quote unquote, living paycheck to paycheck, what happens is you are almost at the exact same. The amounts that you're able to deposit in from your paycheck and stuff like that is almost the exact amount going out, right? And you don't have much savings. You don't have any extra. And so in terms of metabolism and energetics and nutrients and water and things like that, generally we like to have some savings. Now, there can be overcompensation for that, right? If we're talking about nutrients and things, when we get savings in terms of nutrients, that is when we have fat. Now, fat is supposed to be there. It's got lots of jobs, insulation and energy reserves and stuff like that. But a lot of times maybe we have a little bit too much of that. So in terms of your finances, you would love to have a lot of savings. In terms of our body, we don't want to have a lot of savings. We want it to be more in balance like that. Okay? All right, so for water, we're looking at, okay, where do we get these water deposits coming from? Where do we get our intake and our input? And then where's our output? So for intake, how do we regulate intake? The main place in the body that regulates how much fluids we're taking in is the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is a key regulator for homeostasis, both in terms of fluids, also in terms of food. It's also your hunger center. So when we're talking about the digestive system, and we're saying, oh, well, you know, there's neurocontrol for the digestive system, it is that hypothalamus that is often originating some of these signals to the body, monitoring the situation, saying, oh, okay, well, things are getting low, things are getting high, and we want to make adjustments to it. So hypothalamus does that as well. So there's a thirst center there in the hypothalamus that is going to go off if, for instance, the blood volume goes down. So if the blood volume goes down, that's one of the main places where we've got fluids, right? Extracellular fluids. So if it drops by 10 to 15%, oh, now our fluid levels are getting a little bit low. It's like your car oil level getting a little bit low. Your fluids are getting low, you got to add to it, right? Whether it's the coolant or whether it's the oil or whatever. Plasma osmolality increases by 1 to 2%. Remember, osmolality is basically concentration. And we've talked about this in terms of urinary system as well, right? We look at volume and concentration. Both of those give us an idea about this balance between how much water is there compared to the solutes, okay? And if you change one, if you change the amount of water, that changes the volume and the concentration. If you change the amount of solutes, that definitely changes the concentration as well. Not necessarily the volume so much, but at least the concentration. So if our bodily fluids are getting too concentrated, then that's going to set off, oh, we need to drink more so that we can get back to being in balance in terms of fluids and water in the body. And this comes back to the hypothalamus via different types of receptors. It's always the same thing, right? It's always this homeostatic loop where we have receptors that are monitoring the situation right now. What's going on right now? How is it right now? Is it good? Is it good? Is it not good? Sends that information generally back to the brain, and the brain compares that new information, current information, with the stored set point where it should be. And if they are aligned, if they are similar, don't got to do anything. We're good, right? If it's off a little bit, we've got to make corrections. We've got to make adjustments. That's where they have the effector that then makes some sort of adjustment. It's just like driving a car in the lane, right? You're constantly doing that. You've got receptors. You've got, right, special senses, visual receptors, which tells me, oh, I can see the lane and I can see my car in it. You've also got auditory receptors if you're driving by the Braille system. Have you heard that? Oh, in this way, that way, okay? But the receptors tell you, am I getting off from where I should be? And if so, oh, I now know I got to make an adjustment to come back and get back in alignment. Yeah.
So
changing lanes is different. I get it. No, just kidding. Yeah.
No, so is that why people with like type 1 diabetes, they get like insatiably thirsty? Is because the concentration's too high and your body's trying to like flush it out?
Exactly. So
because we run osmolalities at work and they're always on like people who we're gonna suspect their kidneys are doing, will it show up as the concentration's higher or lower?
So what will happen is with people with diabetes, right? So that's an imbalance in terms of glucose. And we'll talk about that in endocrine system. But we know that there are those pancreatic islets in there, they secrete insulin, and that is supposed to tell the liver and the muscles to store glucose when the blood levels are getting too high so that we can use it later on. We can store it there, and then if you need it later on, we can take it from those reserves. And in people that are diabetic, whether it's type 1 or type 2, or they actually talk about type 3 and stuff like that, those people are not regulating blood sugar levels well. We know that when there's too high of glucose in the blood, glucose is small enough, it'll drop through that filter, as we were talking about with the urinary system. It's small enough, it goes through the filter. We reabsorb generally 100% of that. We get it back. Ooh, very valuable, we don't want to lose it. But if those levels are too high, it can kind of go over that transport maximum. Now it's spilling through and it's ending up in the urine, right? So when that happens, when glucose ends up in the urine, remember how we were talking about concentration gradients, right? And there's a concentration or an osmotic gradient which drives the movement of water, allows us to reabsorb more water in that collecting tube as necessary, right? So if there's a bunch of glucose that's staying in the urine, that messes up that osmotic or concentration gradient. Now the water is sitting in a more concentrated solution, or more than it was compared to outside. And so even if we insert those aquaporins, the water's like, I don't know, it's not too different from here or there, and so it might just stay where it is. So people who are diabetic, they're losing glucose in the urine, and the water is sticking in there with it. So they're losing extra water that they shouldn't be because that whole reabsorption isn't working as it should. And so now they're getting at an imbalance for water as well as solutes. And so now this mechanism, that's getting back to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus says, oh, we're getting too concentrated here in our fluids, and maybe even, right, as we're losing water, maybe our blood pressure and blood volume's going down. So this is a response mechanism. This is like, oh, we got to try to fix this. Let's drink more, right?
You hear about people with type 1 diabetes, like when they were kids, they always, I remember Brett Michaels.
Yeah, sure, poison.
He said that he would drink so much water when he was a kid that like his belly would be full of water and he'd still be thirsty.
Okay.
And that was the first indicator that something wasn't
type
right.
1 diabetes,
and
yeah.
And then, kids I've seen, since then, they're always just insatiably thirsty.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's interesting.
Right, yeah. So that glucosuria, that extra amount of glucose that is going out in the urine, it's drawing that water with it. And so now it's throwing it off, the body off in terms of a water imbalance. So the body's responding in however it can to try to bring things back, right? Because fluid balance is really important as well. So
maybe you'll have excess fluid in an osmolality when you run it if your kidneys are shutting down because it's not being utilized the way it's supposed to be. It's just going to be watered down. Right.
So that can be an issue in terms of that urine concentration is not being regulated properly as well. And that's one of the things we do today, right? We're looking at urinalysis in the lab, concentration of various solutes in there, and overall concentration too. Yeah. So these are the receptors that are going to give us some information about it, right? There are chemoreceptors, osmoreceptors, which are constantly testing the concentration of it, and baroreceptors. What are baroreceptors measuring? So a barometer, if you have a weather station,
Pressure.
Yes, right? So baroreceptors are checking pressure, oftentimes blood pressure. We want to make sure blood pressure isn't too high, isn't too low, and if so, we need to make adjustments, okay? So baroreceptors will also help to give us an information about what's going on. So this is kind of a feedback loop, an example of a feedback loop where you've got somebody in the upper left-hand corner, that red right there, we see that plasma concentration has gotten too high, right? It's getting too high and the volume itself is getting too low. So our plasma in our blood is getting too concentrated. So what are we going to do in order to fix that? Well, first off, we have to be able to pick that up. So for instance, we have osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus checking that concentration. We have granular cells that are inside of the kidney that are also checking that as well. And so what they will do they're either checking the concentration or they're checking the pressure. And when we see changes like that, then we're going to initiate some response. The RAS mechanism allows more angiotensin to be released, activated and released. And what that does is that helps to signal our hypothalamus so that we can drink more, so that we can absorb more water in the GI tract, so that we can decrease our concentration and bring it back into the plasma and bring it back to where it should be, right? We're adding more fluid back to it so it's less concentrated. So this mechanism is influencing water intake. So that's one of the ways that we can help to bring it back in balance, is adjust the intake. But of course, we can adjust the outflow or the outtake as well, okay? So regulation of water output, it's going to be a balance between these. So where are we losing water in the body? Now, obviously, in the urine, right? We were talking about the urinary system. We're losing water all the time. Even when we're conserving it, where we're like, oh my gosh, I'm dehydrated, you're still going pee. Not as frequently. The volume's very low, but you've got to use a little bit of water to flush things out. It's like those, kind of water-efficient toilets, right? They use less water, but you got to have some water to wash things out, right? Even if you're conserving water, you got to use some. So the same thing's happening inside of the kidneys as well. So where are we losing this water? So let's take a look at, I thought I had like a little slide that shows the balances of the water. But one of the places where we're losing water, as we mentioned, is in the urinary system. But interestingly enough, we also lose water in other ways. Gosh, isn't there a figure? That one. This is the one that I wanted to go through. This one brings it kind of together. On the left side here, we're showing the intake. These are the places where we get water into the system. And on the right side, we're showing the output. Now, if we look at the overall numbers, 1,500 plus 750 plus 250, it's about 25, about 2.5 liters per day going in and out. In terms of our major intake for water is beverages, right? Drinking water, drinking lemonade, drinking whatever. But you also get about a third of your fluids from your food. Now, it depends on the food that you're eating, right? So if you're eating a meal of straight beef jerky or, concentrated protein bars or something like that, there's not a lot of water in those, right? So that percentage is going to go down. But if, on the other hand, what if you had soup for dinner or something like that? That was your whole dinner. It was almost like a liquid meal. So that's going to tip it the other way. So about a third of your fluid intake comes from foods, and then about 10% from water. Now, what does that mean? Water via metabolism. So 10% of water from metabolism. Remember that way back when we were talking about, in Bio 181, and even at the beginning of 201, you're talking about synthesis reactions and decomposition reactions, right? So there is dehydration synthesis, right? And then there's hydrolysis. And both of those chemical reactions involve water. If you have a big molecule and you're looking to break it up, like when we're talking about digestive system, what you do is you insert a water right in the middle of it, and you split half of it. The hydrogen goes with one molecule, and the hydroxyl, the OH, goes with another molecule, and now we've created two separate smaller molecules, right? And so in that way, we took a molecule of water. It took a molecule of water to insert into that larger molecule and break it into smaller ones. So that's a decomposition. That is, right, we're breaking it down in that way. So that takes water, but on the other hand, if you have two things, if you're doing a synthesis reaction, where you're taking two small ones, you're knitting them together, one of the easiest ways to do that is a dehydration synthesis, where you pull out the hydrogen and the hydroxyl group, and now those two parts of the molecule are able to knit together, and then the product, part of the product, is you get a water molecule out of it. That's why they call it dehydration synthesis, okay? So the point is that those different chemical reactions where we're breaking things apart and knitting them back together, which we're doing all the time, it often involves water. So you may get, just magically, like if we're doing that type of synthesis, you get a water popping up that wasn't there before. So technically that is part of your water balance. Metabolic water, water that is either used in reactions and we lose it temporarily, or it's gained from reactions, that's part of metabolic water. And so there's 10% in terms of our input, our intake, that comes from just metabolic reactions. Yeah?
So is that 10% then taking into account, is it basically subtracting out the water that would be used for hydrolysis? It's like the overall sum of what's being used and what comes out as a product?
A little bit. Like when we look at the kind of the output, now this output per se is usually like lost from the body. But when we talk about the output, there is a little bit of that, right, where the water is kind of disappearing in that side of the calculation as well. So it's just something we can't ignore, right? Because if we look at these numbers, 10% is pretty significant, right? A 10% grade change, that's pretty significant. 10% of your water budget coming from these chemical reactions, that's significant, right? So a lot of it from your input, from actually your activities of drinking and eating, but 10% just from these chemical reactions. And in fact, sometimes your body can change its reactions even to maybe influence the amount of water that it needs, like kind of creating water itself. Yeah. All right, so let's look at the output. Output's pretty straightforward as well. Most of that goes out as urine, like we said. But you also lose some of that in what's called insensible water losses from the skin and the lungs. So about a third of it is lost from insensible water losses. So this is, we know that we sweat. We know that the skin, right, the stratified squamous epithelium is like a barrier, but it's not totally impermeable. So it is possible to lose it from your skin as well. So any exposed skin is going to be losing it to the environment, particularly in the desert. And when you're breathing, remember with the respiratory system, we were moistening the air and warming the air along these respiratory passages. So that's nice for when it comes in. But when you exhale, you lose that same moisture. Now, we don't often see it in the desert, but if you're in a cold environment and you breathe out, you can see your breath, right? That's because you're seeing that moisture loss every time you're taking a breath. So that comes into play too. About a third of our loss is across the skin and out of the lungs when we're breathing, okay? Then there's also sweat, right? Now, depending on what's going on, if it's really hot, you may be losing more sweat, which is why we have to increase our intake in the desert. And then the feces. There's going to be about 100 milliliters, or about 4 to 5%, that has to go in the feces so that we can move it through. If it stays in there too long, we reabsorb even more. Now it's becoming more and more compact, right? And constipation can be the result. So these are the different balances between our intake and our input. And I'm sorry I kind of jumped over that to begin with there. But those are the major sources. So for like the lecture exam, you want to be able to name these major sources of input and output. And then what we were talking about is, what are ways that we can control water intake? And we said hypothalamus is our center for that can cause us to drink more. And then for output, in terms of controlling that, we know that in the kidneys, there is water loss that can occur there, right? So as we talked about obligatory and facultative water reabsorption, there's definitely some obligatory water loss. That means that we have to flush out some of those different kind of waste products in order to produce urine, right? And then there is a little bit of that, like you said, insensible water loss. We're losing it every time we take a breath. When I'm up here talking a lot, I actually get dehydrated. When you guys have to give a presentation or something like that, or if you're at work and you're talking to a lot of people, after a while you're like, oh, man, I got to get a drink, right? Because you're losing a lot of that water. And so you have to try to replace it, okay? Okay. So in terms of what's the main way, we have the control center, hypothalamus, but what's the main hormone involved in water balance? Antidiuretic hormone. So we'd already been introduced to that in the kidney. So there's nothing new here. We just have to know that this is the primary hormone that controls water balance in the body. It stimulates thirst, so that influences the intake. It increases the permeability of those collecting ducts, so we can do that facultative water reabsorption, right? And, in fact, it also works as a vasoconstrictor. Now, we're not listing that in terms of water balance, but think about it. If your fluid levels are getting low and your blood pressure is getting low, in the cardiovascular system, we learn responses to that. You can increase heart rate and stroke volume, right? You can also constrict the blood vessels, and that's going to increase your blood pressure. It's not affecting blood volume, but it's helping to bring up blood pressure. So antidiuretic hormone, if you're in the situation where your fluids are running low and your blood pressure is getting low, number one, it's going to increase our intake. We're going to get thirsty. Number two, we're going to conserve fluid in the kidneys. And number three, we're going to constrict those blood vessels to help jack up blood pressure to help stabilize things, right? So it has various ways that it affects our fluid and pressure in the body. And you can release more antidiuretic hormone if there's a big decrease in blood volume, if you are severely dehydrated, or you're losing fluids in other ways that you shouldn't, right? Vomiting, diarrhea, you're losing excess fluids that you normally shouldn't. Heavy sweating, as we've talked about, as well as burns, because now you can't regulate the fluid from the skin as well as previously. Yeah.
Is that what diabetes insipidus is? When they don't, like, something's wonky with the antidiuretic hormone?
Exactly.
So it's not actually like insulin related, but
right.
That's why. Because my mom always thought I had that because I was always so thirsty, but I wasn't diabetic anyway.
Interesting. So in that case, like we said, in terms of diabetes, it has to do with regulating blood sugar, which then is influencing water. But there's another type of diabetes that people normally don't hear about, diabetes insipidus, where the overall imbalance in fluid levels is occurring, but it's not due to glucose affecting water. It's directly a problem with regulating fluid levels in the body. It's a problem with not having enough antidiuretic hormone. So again, this whole water balance is off. I'm not thirsty enough where I should be. I'm losing fluids out of the kidneys where I should be conserving it, etc. So you see this dilute urine being produced and lots of it, and it's throwing this balance off. Yeah. Okay. So for this, right, dehydration, we're pretty familiar with a lot of ways that we can get into a dehydrated state where we have this negative fluid balance. And there's going to be different types of symptoms that you're going to see: dry, flushed skin, the very little amount of urine being produced, called oliguria. Cotton mouth, right, because your mouth is dry. Even your salivary gland secretion can be affected because that's fluids, right? The fluids that we secrete, salivary gland, pancreatic juice, gastric juice, and stuff like that, all the secretions along the way, bile, have some sort of water aspect to them. And so we can decrease the production of some of those digestive fluids as well. And if we get in a dehydrated state, what happens is, for the most part, we're talking about the extracellular environment, right? The plasma, the interstitial fluid, etc. But we know that these exchanges occur between the extracellular fluid compartments and the intracellular. So if we start getting low in the extracellular fluid out here, then it's going to shrink our cells. Our cells are going to shrink because now we have an osmotic gradient. It's becoming very concentrated here with solutes and less water compared to inside the cell. So water is going to, through osmosis, diffuse out of the cell to try to reach balance there. And that's going to shrink our cells. And if it shrinks our cells significantly, it may change their shape, may change their form and function, right? If it's neurons, if it's muscle cells, now they're not going to perform well because their overall shape is changed due to these imbalances here. So in these cases, right, would be where the cells are sitting in what's called a hypertonic environment. We'll see that term coming up. So in this case, there's a lot of solutes in the surrounding fluids compared to inside of the cells. And so water is going to try to move over there to bring things in balance, and the cells are going to shrink. So when the cells are sitting in a very concentrated hypertonic extracellular environment, they're going to shrink because they're going to be losing water. Okay? Okay. Now, interestingly enough, that's what we're mostly concerned with, is losing water, but there is a case sometimes when you can get overhydrated, right? If you're drinking too much water and you don't have electrolytes and you're doing it very quickly where your kidneys can't regulate that as well, now your extracellular fluid is becoming too dilute. And so your solute levels are going to be at an imbalance as well. Your fluid volume is going to go up, your blood pressure is going to go up, and it's going to be very dilute. So you can have cases where you get to, for instance, hyponatremia. See the Na there? So this is low sodium levels, not because we're having problems regulating sodium, but because we've diluted the fluid too much. We put too much water in there. So imagine if you're making lemonade or tea or something like that, and you just add too much water to it. You're like, oh, this doesn't taste right. It's not because you added the wrong amount of lemonade. It's that you added too much fluid to it and diluted it. So that can also happen in the body. And if we do that, right, sodium levels and different ion levels, electrolyte levels, being at normal is very important for our physiology. So in this case as well, not only does it create an imbalance in terms of concentrations of solutes, but it can cause our cells, in this case, to swell up instead of shrink. So in this case, they're sitting in a hypotonic environment where we have a lot of water out here and very few solutes. And so the water is going to go from here, where it's at a high concentration, to in here, where it's at a lower concentration of water. And it's going to cause those cells to swell up. And in some cases, if those cells can't get rid of the water quick enough, they may swell up and actually burst or lyse. So you can actually lose cells. You can have cell death based on hypotonic hydration, right? It's called overhydration or water toxicity. And that's happened before. People have actually died from that. There are stories about that. There were a story, what was it? It was like a frat or something like that in the town where I grew up in Chico, California, where they're like, oh, we're not going to make them drink alcohol anymore because, oh, we're going to be smart about that, because people were dying from that too, right? So they had this person drinking tons of water instead, and they got water toxicity. So they ended up dying because of that. Yeah.
I was going to ask, in high school, I was in gymnastics, and a girl drank too much water, and they said she depleted her electrolytes, and she had a seizure.
Yes.
What's that process?
Why would that happen? So if you remember, right, especially with our excitable cells include some of our most important ones. Neurons, muscle cells, including skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, right? They're all very dependent on having a high concentration of sodium outside the cell and a high concentration of potassium inside the cell, right? And we have sodium-potassium pumps that are constantly maintaining that. So that when they get stimulated with an action potential, we open up the sodium channels, sodium floods into the cell, and that's depolarization. Then potassium leaves the cell, that's repolarization. So imagine, right, if you diluted the extracellular environment for sodium, hyponatremia, and we open up those channels in response to neurotransmitters, then we open up the channels. Now we don't have that high concentration of sodium outside compared to inside. So we open the channels and sodium's like, nope, I'm good. We're about the same here and there, so I'm not going to move into the cell. That means the cell's not going to depolarize. That means we're not going to generate an action potential. Neurons aren't firing. Muscle cells are starting to also have a problem in terms of contracting or contracting too much, right? So you can have spasms. You can also have it become unresponsive. So it kind of depends. If it's out of whack in any case, then it's not going to be able to respond properly. So it has to do with that carefully maintained balance between concentrations of electrolytes outside of the cell and inside the cell. And so we're always making sure that it's maintained. And if we get out of whack, then they're not going to respond. So edema, we talked about this as well with lymphatic system, because lymphatic system has to do with collecting excess fluids from the tissues and things like that. Usually, we're going to be able to pick up that excess fluid because of osmotic balance, right? Remember, we had filtration where blood pressure was pushing it out, and then we had reabsorption as the capillaries were pulling it back in, again, due to concentration gradients and things like that. So that osmotic pressure can be messed up as well. if you have, again, too many fluids in there for the albumin and things like that. So now we have too many fluids in our plasma, et cetera. The fluids are being pushed into the tissues, and we're getting this localized swelling. Now, this can also happen if you don't have enough of those proteins, so hypoproteinemia, this low level of those plasma proteins, but that is either because we're not making enough of those proteins or they've been diluted so much with that water that they can't have the same amount of force to keep things in balance. Okay, so what we've seen so far is we've been talking mainly about water, intake, as well as output, and how those are kept in balance. We said that antidiuretic hormone is the main hormone that helps to keep those in balance, and the pituitary gland is the main part of the brain that is kind of monitoring that. But we also saw that when we mess with the water concentration, it also affects our solute concentration, most notably these electrolytes. Okay? Now, we also control these electrolytes themselves, and so we have a process for controlling water balance in the body, and we also have processes that are specifically focused on maintaining balances of important ions like sodium, like potassium, and even calcium, right? They have to be in balance. Because as we were just talking about, these different ions are critical for things like neuromuscular activity as well as secretory activity. So remember, like with calcium, it's commonly an extracellular messenger. We have calcium channels open up, and then the neuron releases neurotransmitters in response to that, right? Calcium floods into the cells, and inside of, when we're talking about muscle cells and things like that, right? It floods into muscle cells and allows our sliding filament mechanism to occur, right? It's calcium going in there and binding with troponin that then allows the actin and the myosin to do their job, the sliding filament mechanism. So if those ion levels are off, lots of different things are going to be affected. So we got to make sure that those really important electrolytes or ions are going to be kept in balance. So if, like we were talking about, if you have a water imbalance, if you have an electrolyte imbalance, the body does whatever it can to try to bring it back into balance. And in severe cases, there may be, kind of odd behaviors that you're like, why is this person doing this? It may have to do with an imbalance, like we were talking about, right? People or little kids drinking a lot of water, you're like, why? Why are you doing that? That's out of the norm. Well, it may be that they're not regulating fluids. Same thing in terms of electrolytes. So people that eat like sour things or salty things to excess, that actually may be a response to an imbalance in the body, right? Sometimes you have a craving for salty things, right? Now, of course, that's influenced by, whatever, packaging and advertising and things like that. But at the same time, it may be a signal to your body, like, I need to influence my intake because maybe my sodium levels are getting low. And so I need a little bit more. So that does happen as well. And sour foods are acidic, right? So Sour Patch Kids, Sour Heads, like the Warheads and stuff like that. Anything sour, lemon juice and things, those things have electrolytes or acids in them. And that also may be a case where we're trying to, again, regulate our internal environment by increasing our input. So we mentioned how the adrenal glands release aldosterone. Maybe there's a problem with the aldosterone levels. Aldosterone regulates sodium, and if that's off, if our monitoring system is not doing its job, then maybe we have to influence our intake as opposed to regulating our output instead. This one's always weird. Sometimes you see it like on, there's that show, it's called like My Favorite Addiction or something like that I haven't watched, but I hear all about, right? So sometimes people are eating things that seem very odd. Chalk, clay, starch, burnt mash chips, things like that. In some cases, that may be related to an electrolyte imbalance instead, right? I mean, there are other places where you should be able to get your sodium and calcium and things like that, but little kids may be eating things like that. It might have to do with an imbalance that they just don't recognize. Now, when it graduates to those cases where you see people that are like eating couch cushions and things, I don't know about that. I heard about that one episode. Like this person sitting on the couch, they just have this addiction to eating the cushion material from the couch. they'd be sitting on the couch and unzip the pillow and like take some of the foam and just be like, and then as it would get low, they'd have to replace the foam, and they like keep eating it little bits at a time. People that eat hair, I mean on purpose. I don't know about that, right? There always is a behavioral aspect of it as well. So it's not always necessarily regulated. Like we said, the food that we eat is a lot of times influenced by, right, cultural influences, social things, advertising, etc. It's not just about what the body needs. Okay, so let's take a look then at some of these electrolytes. We're going to look at 3 important ones, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to say, okay, where do we keep it in the body? What helps to regulate it to keep it at normal levels? How do we regulate input and output of this particular electrolyte in order to keep it in balance? Sodium's a big one. We've already been talking about that. Sodium is important in terms of drawing water, right? We see that it creates osmotic pressure. It's critical for that. But sodium itself is very, very important. So the sodium, in terms of the extracellular fluid, accounts for 90 to 95% of all the solutes. And of the 300 milliosmoles that we talked about, the blood starting, the filtrate starting at, in terms of a concentration, 280 milliosmoles is due to sodium. Now, there's other things in there, chloride, potassium ions, calcium ions, magnesium ions, stuff like that, but sodium definitely dominates, right? Single most abundant cation in the extracellular fluid. Yeah?
So I have a question that's related to this, but something else too. The sodium helps us so much in certain processes, but they say if you eat too much sodium foods, it's bad for your heart.
For sure, right?
What?
So we're going the other side, just like water. You're like, oh, water's good for you, right? There shouldn't be any problem. Just drink more water. That's always, just drink more water. But we just said you can go over the other side. If you're drinking too much water and too fast, now blood volume goes up, blood pressure goes up. It's a stress on those blood vessels, stress on the heart. We have to regulate it. And so if we don't have enough time, then we're diluting things, the blood pressure is increasing. Now, in this particular case with sodium is very important, like we said, in terms of helping to move water as well. But if, due to whatever reason, you're just like I said, like sometimes when you're studying, you got an exam coming up, maybe you're snacking at the same time you're studying, you're getting tired, you got to keep moving. Just like when I'm grading, right? Cheez-Its, my go-to. Reduced fat, of course. But Cheez-Its are my go-to, very salty. So I'm sitting there grading, and I got an open box of Cheez-Its right next to me, just like straight out of the bag. In a heavy grading session, maybe a half a box, no joke. Okay? You can imagine, besides carbohydrates, now my carbohydrate levels are going whack, sodium levels are going whack. And so as I'm bringing more sodium in, that is creating more of an osmotic gradient, and now I'm retaining more fluid. So a lot of times when you're eating salty snacks, salty items, the water is going to follow wherever your sodium goes. So if your sodium levels go up, the water is going to go with it. And so you become bloated, you get swollen and things like that, and you can now cause this retention of water, which means, again, blood volume goes up, blood pressure goes up, and that's a stress on both the blood vessels as well as the heart, because we're putting pressure on their walls.
And could that cause edema as well?
Yeah, it can. Yeah. Because with blood pressure being higher, just like we talked about in the glomerulus in terms of the kidney, when we increase blood pressure, there's more pressure on the walls, so we get more fluids being pushed out, and that fluid goes into the tissues, goes into the interstitial space. Now the fluids are swollen as well. So that's why you may actually get puffy and stuff like that, because increased blood pressure is more pressure to push things into the tissues. And we also, double whammy, we may be diluting the blood, so now there's not as much osmotic pressure to draw things back. So both of those things they're supposed to keep in check are now getting out of whack.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So sodium, obviously, most of the sodium that we have comes from our diet, right? We don't make sodium. It's not possible for our bodies to make sodium or anything like that. So most of it comes from our diet. And in terms of controlling it and regulating it, aldosterone is our number one source. So we said the aldosterone as a hormone comes from the adrenal cortex. The adrenal glands are sitting on top of the kidneys. We're just about almost there to talk about endocrine system. Sits on top of the kidneys, and they release aldosterone as part of the RAS mechanism. So if we release aldosterone, what happens? Well, what we have is that sodium-potassium pumps are going to be inserted into those tubules, which allow us to reabsorb more sodium from the filtrate, put it back into the blood. And that is going to allow us to conserve our sodium. So it's like water, right? Antidiuretic hormone allows us to reabsorb water. We keep it in the blood. But this is specific for sodium. So aldosterone allows us to reabsorb even more sodium. So what we have is, for sodium reabsorption, we have a lot of it occurring right off the bat. Remember, the proximal convoluted tubules are the main part of the nephron that does that first reabsorption secretion as it comes out of the glomerulus, right? We're getting it back as soon as we can. So most of our sodium reabsorption occurs there. A quarter of it occurs in the loops of Henle. Okay, now when we say loop of Henle, if you remember, right, like this, we have a descending limb and we have an ascending limb. So in fact, it's sodium being reabsorbed from the ascending limb that causes the water reabsorption in the descending limb. Right? So when I have that written right there in terms of loops of Henle, technically it should say in the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, because sodium is only reabsorbed in the loop of Henle on the ascending limb, not on the descending limb. Okay? But regardless, a quarter of our sodium reabsorption occurs there, and that's obligatory. We have to do that to create the gradient. We have to do that to make sure that we're keeping that sodium, those sodium levels as high as they need to be. So what happens then is after that, so this is right about 90% sum total. So now we have like 10%. So like water, the question is, oh, well, do we need to get rid of this 10% or do we need to hold on to it? And if we need to hold on to more of it, we release aldosterone, and now we reabsorb even more sodium. So sodium-potassium pumps are going to be inserted into those tubules, oftentimes towards the end, and we're going to actively reabsorb it with our sodium-potassium pumps. So create more of these sodium-potassium pumps, and we're going to reabsorb sodium, and we're going to be secreting potassium. Okay? That's going to affect our sodium levels, and it also will affect our water levels because the water tends to follow the sodium. So that is part of, as I mentioned, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. They call it the RAS mechanism. Okay? And that's actually mediated or controlled by our juxtaglomerular apparatus, our JGA, because it is the place where we're going to release the renin, which is the R part of that. So the renin that we get released from that juxtaglomerular apparatus is going to cause the activation of angiotensin, and it's going to cause the release of that aldosterone. So this is what happens. If we see a drop in sodium concentration in the plasma, the juxtaglomerular apparatus is going to sense that, and it's going to release renin, which is going to activate angiotensin, and angiotensin 2 technically, and that's going to get the adrenal cortex to release our aldosterone. And what the aldosterone does is it tells the kidney tubules to reabsorb more sodium. Now technically it's a sodium-potassium pump, so we actually secrete potassium as well. And that then helps us to come back to a balance in terms of sodium levels. Okay? So like we said, it's a balance between input and output. Input is we can ingest more sodium if we need to, salty things. But we also have this way of regulating our sodium output. If we need to conserve it, aldosterone is a hormone to do that. So a key thing as we're going through these electrolytes and water and stuff like that is to say, okay, what's our input? What's our output? What's the hormone or control mechanism that is monitoring it and adjusting it as necessary? With water, it was antidiuretic hormone. With sodium, it's aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. Tells the kidneys to reabsorb sodium. So nothing more that we see with that in terms of, we had already been introduced to that in terms of the kidneys. We talked about aldosterone. So with the monitoring of this, right, we're going to have pressure receptors, baroreceptors. We're going to have osmoreceptors that are checking concentration, etc. And if there's an issue, so for instance, there's too much or too little blood volume or concentration, we're going to change it. We're going to have an effect. So in this case, right, we're seeing the opposite. What if there is an increase in blood volume, What if you're drinking a lot and now, like we said, your blood volume is getting too big or something like that, or it's getting too high? So in this case, we can, right, there's a sympathetic response. We can constrict some blood vessels going to the kidney to reduce that. We can do some afferent arterial, sympathetic stimulation declines. So that's going to open up our blood vessels. We can open up our afferent arterioles, which increases the glomerular pressure and glomerular filtration, which allows our output for sodium and water to increase. So this is if we're on the other side of the coin, where not being dehydrated, but our blood volume has gotten too high. And this is an interesting additional mechanism where we have a hormone, a peptide hormone that's called atrial natriuretic peptide. This is a hormone that comes from the atria of the heart. And it says, okay, if we're dehydrated, blood volume's low, blood pressure's low, we have antidiuretic hormone to try to maintain it. ANP does the opposite of antidiuretic hormone. So this is where the atrial walls, because blood volume is too high and blood pressure is too high, the atria, when the blood returns to the atria, those atria are getting stretched and like, this is way too much. We need to reduce this pressure. So when the atria get stretched, they release atrial natriuretic peptide. And what it does is, this is a hormone that comes from the atria of the heart, and it tells the kidneys to basically release more sodium and release more water. So it inhibits some of these processes. It inhibits our aldosterone system, so we get rid of sodium rather than preserving it. It can inhibit some of our ADH, right? And so it works as an antagonist to the RAS mechanism and antidiuretic hormone. So we have, much like, sympathetic and parasympathetic, where they work antagonistically to each other to keep our homeostasis in check, right? Like a gas pedal and a brake. ANP is going to get rid of blood volume and fluid in order to decrease blood pressure if it's too high, whereas antidiuretic hormone and our aldosterone are going to be working to keep it up. So we have two different mechanisms that work against each other in order to maintain homeostasis, in order to keep it at a nice checkpoint like that. Okay. So ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, and in fact, look at it. Natriuretic peptide. It's got Na right in the name. So it also has an effect on sodium, but this is allowing us to get rid of sodium, so the water will follow it, so the blood volume goes down, so the blood pressure goes down. Okay? Now there are other hormones that can indirectly influence water and sodium levels in the body. So for instance, estrogens can as well. So estrogens, which are sex hormones coming from the ovaries, can influence fluid and electrolyte levels in the body. Because, to be sure, the reproductive cycles in the female affect fluid levels in the body, right? Certain time in the month, you are going to be losing fluids. You'll be losing solutes as well as blood cells as well. But that has a big effect on fluid levels in the body. So your blood volume goes down during menstruation. Blood pressure can go down during menstruation. So what are we going to do? We need to increase maybe drinking to bring those fluid levels up. We're going to get antidiuretic hormones saying, oh, let's not pee as much because we're losing fluids in other ways. And, even sodium levels as well. Part of increasing like salty, right, chips or whatever can help us to retain fluids in these times when we might be losing fluids. So.
Why is there also a chocolate craving? How does that happen?
Chocolate, I think, is just a comfort thing. No, I mean, it could be a variety of things. To be sure, we can't discount comfort things. That, right, if the brain is happier, then, right, can take blood pressure lower just because decreasing heart rate, etc. But, go ahead.
Would glucose be part of that? Glucose retains the water as well.
Glucose could be a part of it as well. And, right, if we're losing cells, we're going to talk about this in reproductive system. You are losing like 90% of the inner lining of your uterus, right, each month. You're losing cells. In order to make new cells, that is an energetically, right, costly endeavor to go mitosis and make new cells to replace those that have been lost. And so you're going to need a lot of cellular energy, right, like glucose to make ATP in order to do that, to do mitosis, etc. So likely for that as well. Yeah.
So I heard that during pregnancy, women with postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome.
Yeah.
I have that.
Yeah.
Their symptoms not necessarily disappear, but they kind of decrease.
Mm-hmm.
Your blood volume is greater.
Is that?
Yeah, so when we talk about like orthostatic hypotension, when we're talking about cardiovascular system, blood volume affects blood pressure, like we said. Now, generally, when you change positions, all your different blood vessels are supposed to constrict and dilate to make sure nothing puddles up down in the feet, goes away from the head, etc. And so that is a response by the cardiovascular system. Maybe the heart rate is supposed to go up a bit. Your blood vessel is supposed to constrict a bit to make sure things stay up here as you stand up. But blood volume is also going to affect that. So if you're dehydrated, now that's even worse, right? Because now your blood pressure is starting out a little bit lower. And when you're pregnant, you need to not only support your body, but the body of another individual. So all of that fluid that goes into that individual, their extracellular, intracellular fluid, where does that come from? It comes from you, right? You're making all that for them, as well as the fluids that's surrounding the developing embryo and fetus, right? As well as that extra blood that is kind of going through the placenta, that whole organ that you've made. So the body boosts that. And we're talking about reproductive system. So there's a boost of fluid levels that are retained in the body and electrolytes and stuff like that. And so that, in support of the developing baby, may, for somebody in that situation, may help their own personal situation where we've increased our blood volume and increased our responsiveness of the cardiovascular system.
I was wondering when I was pregnant that when I would crave chocolate, I don't know if I heard that.
Yeah.
It was because my magnesium was low. And if I took a magnesium supplement, I
Uh-huh.
didn't crave chocolate anymore. And then everything else kind of like leveled out.
Interesting.
Like that electrolyte thing. Because, I mean,
Yeah,
for
could
lack of
be.
a better term, it's like a parasite. It's pulling whatever it needs from you. And if you're not eating.
Yeah, for like 18 years. Yeah, or more.
I know. It gets
Just
more
kidding.
expensive as once they come out, though.
Yeah, yeah.
What causes, when some women are pregnant and like during their pregnancies, they're diabetic, but only for their pregnancy? It goes away.
Gestational diabetes.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, in those cases, like we said, the adult body is going through a lot of different changes and trying to accommodate the physiology of this new individual that's going on there. So the activities of that baby that is developing, right? There are some changes in terms of metabolic activity as new organs are forming or as they're getting bigger, etc. And whatever changes is happening there, whatever the body of the adult is, has to accommodate both of them. So I'd have to look into specific causes from it, but I think it's just, yeah, go ahead.
You're at high risk for like diabetes, like down the road anyway. It's typically like a genetic kind of like predestination too. So
Kind of like a
you're
precursor.
more likely to have it when you're in gestational diabetes, and then later on after you're done childbearing, if you pack on some extra weight or whatever, that diabetes mellitus tends to occur more often.
Yeah. So, like we were talking about where your adult body's retaining more fluids because they're going to have to supply the baby and all their fluid environment, stuff like that. You also tend to try to retain more nutrients, right? So you're taking more in, and then those glucose levels may be increased. Now, they're supposed to be delivered to the placenta, to the baby, and the baby's supposed to be using them. But now, again, you're kind of monitoring and maintaining two individuals. So you're probably maintaining a lot of things at a higher level than normal, just in case the baby needs it. And then if they don't, you're like, oh, okay, well, now I'm at an imbalance, so now I got to try to get rid of those. And so, it's kind of like if you have a small business, it's kind of easy to run. I only got a small few people that I got to worry about payroll, and I got to worry about, where they are and stuff like that. The bigger the business, the more complicated it gets because the more moving parts there are, more people and stuff like that. So we just have to do with that. Okay. So, as we were talking about, sex hormones can have an influence on sodium balance in the body. Estrogen, progesterone, and even, we'll talk about this, some glucocorticoids later on. All right. So this little table right here just kind of brings together a bit of, as we were mentioning, some of the ways that sodium is controlled. And the main hormones that are involved are going to be aldosterone on the one hand, and then atrial natriuretic peptide. Those two hormones right there have a direct control of sodium in the body, right? Sodium being released or sodium being reabsorbed. Now, technically, antidiuretic hormone also influences electrolyte levels in the body because we're either diluting the fluids or allowing them to become more concentrated. And so antidiuretic hormone can have an effect on sodium levels, but it's not a direct effect. We're just like adding more water to it or taking water from it. But aldosterone and AMP, those are the hormones that control sodium levels in the body. Aldosterone causing us to reabsorb and hold on to it. Atrial natriuretic peptide causing us to release it in the kidneys. Okay? Okay. So the next one that we're doing, we've done sodium. Next one that we're doing is potassium. Remember, that's that one. Now the cool thing about this one is that potassium balance in the body is, in most cases, directly linked to sodium balance in the body because we are using that sodium potassium pump. It's called the sodium potassium ATPase or antiporter or whatever. And so we want to make sure that our sodium levels are maintained. Potassium levels have to be maintained as well. Because remember, with all those excitable cells, depolarization was due to sodium. Repolarization, going back to the relaxing state or the resting potential, was due to potassium levels. So we have to maintain potassium levels as well. If your potassium, look, kalemia, there's our K right there. So that has to do with hypokalemia, low potassium, hyperkalemia, high potassium. Those ones can affect muscle activity as well, right? So you aren't able to repolarize the cells, and now you're not going to get muscle contraction, right? You're not going to get conduction of electrical activities in the heart. Now, technically, hydrogen comes into play here too. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But the sodium-potassium pump can also be a sodium-hydrogen pump. And so in cases where the pH is getting off, or being at an imbalance, we may substitute hydrogen for potassium, and now, because we're focusing on hydrogen levels, we may see potassium levels get off. But the great thing about our potassium levels in the body, like I said, they're mainly controlled by the same hormones that we had talked about before, right? Aldosterone and AMP. So those same hormones that allow us to reabsorb sodium allow us to secrete potassium. So in the collecting ducts, etc., that's where we can insert more of the sodium-potassium pumps. And so when we're reabsorbing sodium, we're actually secreting potassium. And that's one of the things that we see today in the PhysioX exercise is that with aldosterone being released, we see more potassium being secreted into the urine. And that is, on the flip side, of more sodium being pulled from the urine as well. Okay? So it's the same mechanism that we saw before in terms of the hormones that are involved. Aldosterone and atrial natriuretic peptide. Because it's a sodium-potassium pump that is regulating potassium levels, just like it's regulating sodium levels. It's two sides of the same coin. Okay? So it's kind of like, this is kind of like when we were talking about when we were going through the kidney, we were like filtration, reabsorption, secretion. And by the time we got to secretion, it was like easy, where it was just like, oh, well, it's just these couple of things, and we're, right? This is the secretion that we're talking about. And there are very few things that are secreted, and it's mainly due to that sodium-potassium pump regulated by aldosterone. Okay? Okay. Third one is calcium. Calcium, which has a +2 charge, it's also an important cation. Now, calcium, like sodium, is mainly found in the extracellular fluid. If you remember that little chart at the beginning of this chapter, we talked about major ions that are found inside and outside the cell. Sodium is super abundant outside the cell. Calcium is also very abundant outside the cell. So these are the main extracellular cations. Potassium, on the other hand, is mainly elevated inside the cell, intracellular fluid instead. Okay? So, for calcium, like we mentioned, it's important in terms of cell membrane permeability, in terms of muscle contraction, secretions like release of neurotransmitters, even blood clotting, right? Calcium is an extracellular messenger in the blood clotting cascades as well. So we need to make sure calcium levels are maintained in the body, not too high, not too low. If it gets too low, look, hypocalcemia. Look, there's a Ca right there in the center of it, and it has an extra C. Hypocalcemia is where we have too low of blood calcium. And so in that case, it can actually increase excitability in muscle cells and nerve cells, and it can lead to muscle tetany. So tetanus, right, is where a muscle contracts and it's not allowed to relax. So if we have hypocalcemia, then we're not going to get these muscle cells doing what they're supposed to do. And hypercalcemia is too high. There's our Ca, there's our extra C to remind us that we're talking about calcium. And this is going to overall inhibit our neurons and muscle cells, and it also may also cause arrhythmias, irregular heartbeat as well. So a lot of important tissues that are affected by calcium. We want to make sure it's not too high or too low. So how do we control calcium balance in the body? Well, calcium also comes mainly from our diet, but we do have places in the body where we can store it. Where are the main organs where we store calcium in the body? That's an easy one. In the bones, right? That's what we learn about in elementary school. Like, oh, we drink milk because it's good for our bones and stuff like that, right? That's not the only place where we get calcium, but we store it in our bones. And we have this balance between our osteoblasts, which build bone, and osteoclasts, which chew up the bone. And those activities of those cells will either put calcium into the bone, we're building bony matrix, we take it out of the blood and we knit it into bone, or we chew up the bone and we release the calcium from the bony matrix that we just chewed up, right? We just gave it back to the blood. And so those activities are controlled, right, between osteoblasts and osteoclasts. They're controlled by another couple of hormones. One's called parathyroid hormone, abbreviated PTH, comes from parathyroid gland. And the other one's called calcitonin. And calcitonin actually comes from the thyroid gland instead. So they're very close in terms of where they come from. But these two hormones have opposite effects in terms of calcium. And in fact, phosphate is often tied to calcium. Like potassium is often tied to sodium. Phosphate levels, PHO4, is often attached to calcium because we make calcium phosphate in the bones when we're knitting it together. So what happens here in terms of calcium is parathyroid hormone promotes increasing calcium levels in the blood, and it tells, right, those osteoclasts to chew up the bone. That's what I was always thinking in 201, is that the C in osteoclast means that they are chewing up the bone. That means bone, right? So they're chewing up the bone. Calcium levels in the blood have gotten low. They're chewing up the bone, and they're releasing that calcium into the blood. So that's one organ where we respond. And then parathyroid hormone also tells the small intestine to absorb as much calcium we can from what we've eaten and drinking, right? From those sources, we want to absorb more calcium. And then finally, parathyroid hormone tells the kidneys to do calcium reabsorption. So if we do calcium reabsorption, now we're holding on to the calcium that we have absorbed in the digestive system, okay? So parathyroid hormone has three target organs then. Bones, with the osteoclast chewing them up or not. Small intestine, absorbing it the first time. Kidneys, reabsorbing it the second time. Making sure we hold on to it, okay? So parathyroid hormone works to increase blood calcium levels. Calcitonin is antagonistic. So what it does is it basically decreases blood calcium levels instead. So what that means is if we have a lot of calcium into the system, if you ate a straight up, if you're going to eat fondue or something like that, there's a whole lot of cheese, there's a whole lot of calcium coming in. And so in those cases, blood calcium levels may be getting too high, and so we may need to release calcitonin, which has the opposite effects in terms of calcium levels. So it's going to tell our osteoclasts to basically settle down. Don't chew up the bone. Let's knit the bone. Let the osteoblasts do their job and knit the bone. Pull it out of the blood, knit the bone. Create more bone tissue. Small intestine, we're good on calcium. Don't need to absorb it. Let's let it go into the feces. And kidneys, same thing. Let's not reabsorb it. We got enough calcium. Just let it get filtered out. It's an ion. It'll get filtered out. Let it go. Don't grab onto it, right?
Is that something that can get to be too high where it's like setting too much calcium in your system? Is that why they test for calcitonin?
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah, then you can have an imbalance with this, right? Calcitonin generally gets released if you've got really high levels. Generally, parathyroid hormone handles it, right? If we need to increase blood calcium, parathyroid hormone does that, and then we just ease off on it and toss it down.
What's the difference between ionized calcium?
So that just has to do with the form of calcium it is. So we'll get into that maybe a little bit
sorry,
more.
I didn't
Yeah.
get that.
No, not a problem. But I was noticing we were running out of time. So what we're seeing is we've gotten through the water section of it. We've gotten through the ions, talked about sodium, potassium, as well as calcium. And so the last section that we have to talk about in terms of this chapter is acids and bases, right? So we'll finish that up at the beginning of our time on Wednesday, and then the rest of the time we'll just be reviewing. Okay, we'll go back to urinary system, go back to digestive system, etc. All right. So those of you that had the earlier morning lab, you are free to go and start looking